very much. Thank you, Paul. Yes, I do consider Forum Europe to be a friend, but I always like to make their life difficult. So when we were discussing this conference, I said that I didn't want my name to be too associated with VMware. I even asked for there to be a different backdrop. Now, of course, that would suggest that simply we are somehow allergic to VMware. That's not actually the case. It's that when we talk about such an important subject as sovereign cloud, we have to make the point that the European Commission has a very strong position, and we are independent of any provider of service, be they European-based or non-European based. So while recognizing the role that VMware have played, including in the introduction of certain what were at the time key developments in cloud, such as the container approach to cloud computing, to get to the serious matter of today, you have to understand that the Commission has a very clear view on where we want to get to. We don't, however, have a definition of sovereign cloud. And I'll come back to that, because when I was asked to speak today, it was in relation to the Commission's vision with regard to the future of the data economy, in particular then, of course, to cloud in the context of our data strategy and our digital strategy. But that, I have to first of all remind you, is intrinsically linked to our overall vision about Europe's place in the world, about achieving an open but autonomous, an open but sovereign economy. And those two may sometimes appear to be in contradiction, but it is very important that you realize that we do want to work with all of the partners who are willing to come and provide services in Europe. But there are certain conditions, and I'm going to explain what those are. It's not just about growth and innovation, although those are essential. It's also about competition and the integrity of European data, which I think is the discussion that we're going to have today. Back when we introduced the data strategy, of course, that was a couple of weeks before Europe shut down with the COVID crisis and attention was elsewhere. But it nevertheless is something that we have been working through in the years with the industry in order to ensure that the European economy is benefiting from advanced data services and digital services. And in that strategy, we recognize cloud computing as an essential component for growth, for innovation, and for sovereignty. By the end of this year, we expect that cloud computing should be worth about 560 billion euros in the European economy. But nevertheless, in 2021, only 41% of EU businesses use cloud computing. And that is worrying, because when I started working in this area nearly 10 years ago, in fact 10 years ago now, we were already quoting figures about the alarmingly poor adoption rate of cloud across all sectors of the European economy. That is slowly improving, but it is still nevertheless something that we want to drive forward for all of the reasons of productivity, efficiency, and data security that cloud technologies provide. And there again, we need all of the providers to be here providing those services. That is our ultimate mandate. It is to ensure that the European economy, small businesses in sectors that you wouldn't even associate with the ICT sector, are actually using these tools for their own advantage and to the advantage of their consumers. Without cloud, we don't have proper implementation of big data policies. We certainly don't have implementation of AI. We can't implement blockchain technologies. This is why it is such an important foundation for so much of the other developments that we wish to see in the economy. We have an objective under our Digital Decade program to have 75% of all businesses by 2030 using cloud. And that, of course, is not just the big businesses. They're the ones who are normally convinced and maybe also have the in-house resources to make the switch. We have to make it easier for others to move from on-premises onto the cloud. Because it is, as I've said, it's an essential underpinning for those technologies that we want to see introduced, for competitiveness of business vis-a-vis their international competitors. And also, of course, it allows the use and adoption of data-driven technologies across all sectors. So as I said, we don't have the definition for sovereign cloud. But perhaps what I would say to Laurent, I would add to the list of things that he said one more element, which is essential and which drives our vision of sovereign cloud in Europe. And that is for Europe to have the capacity, in a worst-case scenario, to move and to act on its own. So COVID was one major challenge. The Ukraine war, the invasion by Russia, has also pointed out a whole lot of even more serious challenges. That was against the backdrop of increasing geopolitical tensions, which saw supply chains threatened and which saw the actual ability to provide service or even to furnish the equipment on which those services are provided was increasingly under threat. And that is why what we have been doing across the data value chain, the compute continuum, from microelectronics up to services, has been with the vision to remain open, to remain competitive, but to ensure that Europe has autonomy. Looking then at what are those self-sufficiency, or at least what are the elements where we want Europe to have greater capacity? Of course, it's not about infrastructure as a service. That's a commodity market now. We're talking about advanced cloud and edge technologies. We're talking about the development of latency-critical applications and the edge, far edge, and cloud computing that requires, especially, as I've said, for the artificial intelligence piece. The data strategy focused on our needs in order to get there, and we have even set targets for ourselves. In the digital decade, we've set a target of having 10,000 climate-neutral, highly secure edge nodes across Europe by 2030. In fact, we expect that we will need more. But indeed, that is a basic target where we need to ensure that industry has the capacity to invest and roll out, but we will need, in some cases, government support, public sector support for that to be achieved. And I did say climate neutral, because there is another condition which is increasingly needing to be hardwired, designed into the rollout of advanced cloud technologies, and that is sustainability. It will be one which will actually impose cost on providers, and it is again, as with all internal market scenarios for the European Union, it is our role to ensure that those who follow the rules, who follow the best practice, are not undercut by those who don't. In other words, by those who are cutting corners by not respecting sustainability laws, the best practice with regard to power consumption, use of materials, reuse of water, etc., etc., etc. That is what the internal market legislation seeks to do. It is to encourage and reward industry for developing on the standards which it sets, but which are best in class. The data strategy then came on top of our digital strategy in order to set a series of objectives with regard to the use of data, access to data, in order to ensure that that can be harnessed and reused. Just last week, the Data Act was in fact agreed. We have a few bureaucratic processes to get to have the final legal text, but the deal is done. And that political agreement allows us now to have greater certainty about what the Data Act can achieve. It will break down barriers that keep cloud users from switching providers. It will make that process of portability easier. Ultimately, it'll be free, fast, and it will empower cloud customers, not just to make binary switching decisions, but actually to move to multi-cloud. Perhaps in some cases to move back onto premises, but in many cases to move to more advanced hybrid services where there are multiple providers involved. So that ability to switch, to adapt to these more advanced services as they come available, is allowing the economy, allowing small businesses to adapt and actually to benefit. And that in turn benefits the providers of advanced digital services, including, of course, cloud. We need to underpin that with open interoperability standards, which is something which we have worked with industry for quite a while. We are hesitant, as usual, to regulate first. We want the industry to set those standards. We've worked on in the past with them. But of course, at the end of the day, if for competitive advantage reasons, one or other company or one or other sector is not playing ball with regard to these standards, well then the Commission will intervene. As I said, we also tackle barriers with regard to the in-parallel use of services, which will also provide, we feel, a niche for smaller European companies providing specialist services, where CTOs, those purchasing from larger companies, no longer have to take a binary choice of one provider, but can actually mix and match and can actually go as appropriate for their business use and their case to go also for smaller providers of specialist services as part of that cloud mix that they will take. So our approach is looking at the European economy, but it is hopefully not inward. It is open but assertive. And that brings us to a key issue of what has been identified as the key point of cloud sovereignty, which is the data. the security of the data, in some cases the location of the data. Remember, you're talking here with some colleagues in the room, the people who actually pushed through the free flow of data regulation. We insisted that we develop a situation in which we have a single market for data in Europe, which benefited all providers of cloud services, whether they be European or not. But in the same way, we want to ensure that that data is safe, secure, and protected. And here we come to the question of who is going to be part of the sovereign cloud. Because what we are clear from the examples that we've seen from today's sponsor and from other operators who are not headquartered in Europe is that there is the ability and willingness to create the legal and technical vehicles to protect data and keep it within Europe. However, there are countries with extraterritorial legislation who can nevertheless reach over those structures and demand from headquarters, for example, in the United States, and let's not forget also in China, to actually have access to data, in some cases without even going through the mutual assistance facilities which exist between countries. And it is that situation which means that we are being assertive. It is that situation which has led the European Union to insist on data localization where there is no guarantee that that data cannot be subject to extraterritorial seizing. That will continue to be a discussion. We've had full and frank discussions with our colleagues, particularly in the Trade and Technology Council. But of course, there is an attempt to make parallels in some cases with the legislation in one or other bloc. It is not an ideal situation for us to start from, but when we are sometimes criticized with regard to, for example, the drafts of the European Union cloud certification, cybersecurity certification. It is interesting sometimes to look at what does the Patriot Act say, what does the Cloud Act say, what does FedRAMP say about cloud provision for federal services with regard to sensitive data. Is Europe doing something that is not already done elsewhere? That's a discussion which we're willing to have. But what it shouldn't do is distract from our primary goal of having European companies and European society in all sectors and of all sizes, having them being able to access advanced cloud and edge computing services, which will allow them to drive their business and allow the European economy to be innovative, advanced, competitive, and open. That is our objective under the data strategy. That is what we are achieving with regard to now the Data Act, and we hope in the future with regard to the cybersecurity certification scheme. We will be introducing some guidelines with regard to public procurement. That's guidance on public procurement, in order particularly to help, but also to encourage public authorities to be clear on what the rules are, but also what are the industry standards, what is the best practice, what are the codes of conduct. I stress that this is not a new set of rules. This is a formulation in one place of a repository of the rules and best practices that exist, so that there's a toolbox for providers and users, and there's guidance for government with regard to public procurement. So there's a toolbox and the guidance on public procurement. And with that, we want to achieve this open but autonomous cloud market, also where there is less risk of vendor lock-in, and where, of course, there are effective safeguards against unlawful data access. Anybody who's prepared to live and work according to those basic principles is not only welcome, but is a vital player in the European sovereign cloud of the future. Thank you very much.
Sit there. I need to try to, I'm going to fall off the edge. Right, thank you, Pearse. Before we go to a couple of questions, I've been asked by my colleagues to point out that on the holding screens, there's a QR code that links to a poll, and you're encouraged to be aware of it and take part in the poll, which will be running throughout the whole day of the conference. Okay, there's a QR code, hopefully, right. So, questions. I was taking lots of notes. Pearse, you've been quite provocative, as you usually are, so you didn't disappoint. Anybody in the audience or online would like to ask Pearse a question before I jump in with a whole list of my own questions? Feel free to raise your hand.
I wasn't provocative enough.
Okay, all right. Well, okay. Let me. It's you, sir. Okay. Would you mind, in time-honored fashion, give your name and organization?
Yeah, so
as well?
Xavier Poisson-Beauchamp, I'm working at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. I would like to know if you have a clear visibility or not for the date for EUCS enforcement, meaning that it has been discussed many years. Do you have a fixed agenda now which is coming or not? Thank you.
Thank you. The short answer is no, we do not, because it's not entirely under our control. But the process at least has unblocked. So in fact, there will be a meeting of member states in the expert committee meeting in ENISA, who, as you know, are responsible for formulating the scheme. They'll be meeting again mid-July, and we hope to have developments over the summer. It is our wish, but again, this is far from giving you a firm date. It is our wish that we can have the scheme adopted in the autumn. But there has been a lot of political discussion about elements, so we know that there will be a final, not approval process, because in fact it is the Commission that decides, but we will have to consult once more with the Member States to ensure that this is something that will actually be implemented.
Right. Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone just behind you.
Yes, hi. Could you give some
Give
insights?
your name, sir, and organization.
Hans Hendricks from Uniserver, Netherlands. I wonder if you could give some insights about those political discussions that are currently around ACS.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Right, that was brief and to the point. Any more questions? Let me, no? Waiting, all right. Let me go back a bit, if I may, Piers, because you did say at the beginning there's no, actually, as we speak, no definition of a sovereign cloud. It's hard to believe, but 3.5 years ago, when the Van der Leyen Commission took office in its 5-year term, there was no pandemic, there was no Ukraine war, and yet she did say, maybe in a very prescient way, my commission would be a geopolitical commission. And I just wonder, how does that trickle down to DG Connect? You obviously you inherited lots of dossiers and lots of strategies from the previous commission. You're more or less a key player in DG Connect in the last commission, never mind this commission. And I just wonder how the geopolitics of the commission now influences and informs how you go about doing your work. And maybe a link to that. You gave me the impression when I was listening to you that you're slightly... you're certainly aware of the potential for malpractice or for bad behavior out there. So to what extent, because the Commission, as you know better than I do, is often accused of being reactive rather than proactive, because maybe they have no choice but to be like that. But do you think there's going to be a change in attitudes by people like yourself in dealing with these kind of issues?
Oh, okay, well, thank you. Yes, certainly from my own personal experience reflecting, this is a more geopolitical commission. I guess it's not just because President von der Leyen decided that we would be, because necessarily through geopolitical events. Let's face it, it was already the case that the grounds were shifting when she took office and the new commission took office. We had had a very uncomfortable relationship with the previous US administration,
right,
which had brought some of the sort of the comfortable truths which we had lived with regard particularly to the technology sector, suddenly were being brought into question. And that was a perfect storm with regard then to the growing assertiveness and the growing difficulties that we had with Chinese economic and technical power mixed with political developments, which we saw. I mentioned the Chinese Cybersecurity Act. We saw then subsequently the significant problems that we had, and again it was in my team, but with 5G rollout and the security of 5G technologies, including the radio access network. And all of that came together to mean that we realized we could not be reactive. Of course, we would probably say we were never reactive, but it's out there. So we have to anticipate these issues, and that is actually what is driving open autonomy, open digital autonomy. If you take the CHIPS Act, for example, that is not an attempt to create a European chips industry, which will then mean that Europe is self-sufficient in chips. That's actually not possible. It was simply an ambition to contribute to the world market share, but to increase our capacity from 10% to 20% of world production in, I said, this very, very sensitive geopolitical situation, particularly with regard to Taiwan. The United States had the same ambition to drive, again, not trying to be fully autonomous, but to drive the percentage of world supply that they could actually source. And that really goes across the entire digital value chain. So when it comes to the areas with which I'm more familiar, we are, for example, taking strides to really push European capacity for the development of 6G. Again, we really want that to be a global standard. We want to be working with our global partners on that. But we don't want, we want to try and avoid the tendencies that we've even seen with some of the implementations of 5G to have a divorce, to have a split in global technologies. That would be disastrous, we think, for technology users, whatever about technology providers. And therefore, when it comes to the issues of accepting that we have this global open network or network of networks, where can we intervene to ensure that what is even more valuable, the data, more sensitive, the data, is secure? That is why so much of what we have done has related to cybersecurity and to the protection and security of data, to the extent of, in some cases, insisting, or at least allowing that member states are allowed to ensure that the data stays on the territory of the European Union. Right. Depending on the category of seriousness. So it's work in progress. I would again, speaking personally, I would expect that this will become an even stronger feature of the next commission that will take office next year.
A quick question to finish off. You mentioned briefly in passing the Trade Technology Council that I don't think it was set up necessarily with this in mind, but do you see the TTC as some kind of dispute resolution mechanism before disputes become real disputes?
If you want to say that way, I wouldn't want to say that way, because I was in Luleo at the fourth meeting. There was a lot of frank discussion. Whether that was dispute or not, I don't know. But it is certainly an environment in which both sides do speak very clearly, and do speak not just about things that have happened, but the things that are going to happen or we anticipate may happen, in order to avoid tensions. So it perhaps does fulfill that process. It certainly isn't how we describe it. But we've already, for example, in my area, I co-chair one of the groups, we've had very useful discussions on issues where we are arguing about Open RAN, for example, but also where we do look to how do we work with not just the United States, but together work with like-minded countries on protecting data. Again, an example.
Right. We'll let you go. You have the job to do, I know, back at the ranch. Thank you again for your time, Pearse.
Thank you.